amongst mammals. I'm put succinctly, we get different diseases and are likely to die in different ways from most of our ancestors, or from most humans currently living in less privileged areas of the planet. Our nights are filled with worries about a different class of diseases. We are now living well enough and long enough to slowly fall apart. The diseases that plague us now are ones that are slow accumulation of damage. Heart disease, cancer, cerebrovascular disorders. While none of these diseases are particularly pleasant, they certainly mark a big improvement over succumbing at age 20 after a week of sepsis or dengue fever. Along with this relatively recent shift in patterns of disease, have come changes in the way we perceive the disease process. We have come to recognize the vastly complex intertwining of our biological and our emotional sides, the endless ways in which our personalities, feelings, and thoughts both reflect and influence the events in our bodies. One of the most interesting manifestations of this recognition is understanding that extreme emotional disturbance can adversely affect us, and put in the parlance with which we have grown familiar, stress can make us sick. And a critical shift in medicine has been the recognition that many of the damaging diseases of slow accumulation can be either caused or made far worse by stress. In some respects, this is nothing new. Centuries ago, sensitive clinicians intuitively recognized the role of individual differences in vulnerability to disease. Two individuals could get the same disease, yet the course of their illness could be quite different, and in vague, subjective ways might reflect the personal characteristics are smart enough to see things coming and, based only on anticipation, can turn on a stress response as robust as if the event had actually occurred. Some aspects of anticipatory stress are not unique to humans. Whether you are a human surrounded by a bunch of things in a deserted subway station, or a zebra face to face with a lion, your heart is probably racing. Even though nothing physically damaging has occurred yet. But unlike less cognitively sophisticated species, you can turn on the stress response by thinking about potential stressors that may throw us out of homeostatic balance far into the future. For example, think of the African farmer watching a swarm of locusts descend onto his crops. He has eaten an adequate breakfast and is not suffering the homeostatic imbalance of starving, but the farmer will still undergo a stress response. Zebras and lions may see trouble coming in the next minute, and immobilize a stress response in anticipation, but they can't get stressed about events far into the future. And sometimes we humans can be stressed by the things that simply make no sense to zebras or lions. It is not a general mammalian trait to become anxious about mortgages or the Internal Revenue Service, about public speaking or fears of what you will say at a job interview, about the inevitability of death. Our human experience is replete with psychological stressors, a far cry from the physical world of hunger, injury, blood loss, or temperature extremes. When we activate the stress response out of fear or something that turns out to be real, we congratulate ourselves with this cognitive skill, which allows us to mobilize our defenses early, and these anticipatory defenses can be quite protective, in that a lot of what the stress response is about is preparative. But when we get into a physiological uproar and activate the stress response for no reason at all, or over something that we cannot do anything about, we call it anxiety neurosis. He attempted to inject his rats daily, but apparently not with a great display of dexterity. Celia would try to inject the rats, miss them, drop them, spend half the morning chasing the rats around the room, or vice versa, flailing with a broom to go get them out and behind the sink, and so on. At the end of a number of months of this, Celia examined the rats and discovered something extraordinary. The rats had peptic ulcers, greatly enlarged adrenal glands, the source of two important stress hormones, and had shrunken immune tissues. He was delighted. He had discovered the effects of the mysterious ovarian extract. Being a good scientist, he ran a control group. Rats injected daily with saline alone, instead of the ovarian extract, and thus every day. They too were injected, dropped, chased, and chased back. At the end, lo and behold, the control rats had the same peptic ulcers, enlarged adrenal glands, and atrophy of the tissues of the immune system. Now, your average budding scientist at this point might throw up his or her hands and furtively apply to business school, but Celia instead reasoned through what he just observed. The physiological changes couldn't be due to the ovarian extract after all, since the same changes occurred in both the control and experimental group. What did the two groups of rats have in common? Celia reasoned that it was his less than trauma-free injections. Perhaps he thought these changes in rats' bodies were some sort of non-specific response of the body to genetic unpleasantness. To test this idea, he put some rats on the roof of the research building in the winter, others down in the boiler room. Still others were exposed to forced exercise or to surgical procedures. In all cases, he found increased incidence of peptic ulcers, adrenal enlargement, and atrophy of the immune tissue. We know now exactly what Celia was observing. He had just discovered the tip of the iceberg of stress-related disease, legend mostly promulgated by Celia himself, has it that Celia was the person who, searching for a way to describe the non-specificity of the unpleasantness to which the rats were responding, borrowed a term from physics and proclaimed that the rats were undergoing stress. In fact, by the 1920s, the term had already been introduced to medicine in roughly the sense that we understand it today, by a physiologist named Walter Cannon. What Celia did was to formalize this concept with two ideas. The body has a surprisingly similar set of responses, which he called the general adaptation syndrome, but which we now call the stress response, to a broad array of stressors